Why do we need poems of our own? Or do we? What's the difference between a poem that we might just casually like and one that we actually love and own? Well, that's what we're going to get into today. And that means you're listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure with Dale Byron. That's me. This is a place where we look at poetry in a very different way or in a unique way, and meaning that we look for poems that we can hitch up to our lives in practical ways, poems that help us navigate our lives, understand our lives, poems that really enliven this journey and just help us in so many different ways. And as I've said before, no subject is off limits. And today, our title for this episode is How to Make a Poem Your Own. Now, maybe you already have some favorite poems. Maybe you already have some poems that you love. We're going to really kind of dig into what that means again when we own a poem. And I find that a lot of people, if even if they don't have favorite poems, they actually sometime in their lives or maybe currently they have favorite songs that they really love. Well, I think what you're going to find today is that when we talk about these poems that we own, it's a lot like those songs that we first fell in love with. And it's a lot like what those songs did for us, both at the emotional level, at the intellectual level, and in a lot of different ways. So um, I said when I was putting together my notes today, I said, when you read or hear a just right poem, you will know it. Again, much like a song, the poem will delight and stun you. It will do something vital for you. Strangely, the poem will feel as if it owns you first. Then, in turn, you'll feel a kind of second wave, which is owning the poem back. I call it a sacred claiming when that happens. In this week's episode, I will share how that process works, at least from my own experience over many years and working with many people and many poems, of course, while revealing some of my own favorite poems. I have many poems that I feel like I love and that in the way I'm talking about it today, I own and own back. And we'll talk about some of those. So I think it all starts with a kind of hunger inside us. It's often not completely named, but if named, it would be something like a yearning to remember something important, to understand something more deeply, to grow in some way, emotionally, intellectually, to or even in terms of wisdom. At times a poem can do that for us, to rebalance our lives. So much of our lives today seem to be pulled and tugged: social media, politics, environmental concerns. We are tugged in so many different ways, and sometimes a poem, especially a poem that we own, can help rebalance us so that we're more happy and effective and centered in our lives. A poem can obviously inspire us. That's one of the more well known ways that we interact with poetry. They can certainly help us be more grateful. And also, um, particularly, this is also how many of us find poems or come to poetry is in the midst of some loss, and poems help us grieve, no doubt about that. So let me start where my own poetry journey started nearly 3 decades ago. um, I was not looking for poetry, certainly. I was not looking for any particular poem. In fact, like many people, I had had a kind of checkered past with poetry. I had some well meaning teachers in my grade school days that I don't know if they loved poetry or not, but the way they taught it did not have me love it. So, Again, I wasn't looking for anything, but these are the words that I heard again about 3 decades ago, and they were stunning to me. Let me say those words. It's an excerpt from a poem, a much longer poem by William Carlos Williams, the famous pediatrician turned poet at the turn of the last century. He said it like this. He said, my heart rouses, thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you, that concerns many men, many women. Look at what passes for the new. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in the old despised poems. It is hard to get the news from poems. Yet men die miserably, yet women die miserably every day, for the lack of what is found there. Now, I've told the story of it's sort of my origination story for my love of poetry. And I've told it many times, but I think about that night, that evening when I heard this amazing poet in a kind of Irish brogue read this poem or recite this poem. And I found it, I said, first of all, I said, who could write such ridiculous words? How could poetry be that important to us? How could that happen? But you know what? I couldn't forget these lines, and I couldn't work out how someone could be so uh, brash as to say something like this. But that's when I was hooked. That was the first piece of a poem. This is a much longer poem, actually, but that was the first time that I actually felt like I owned a poem. And again, we're going to talk about all the stages of that. But one stage of owning a poem doesn't always have to be this way, but you may actually find yourself memorizing a poem or a piece of a poem that you own, that you love deeply. Um, but I thought this poem by William Carlos Williams was so amazing. Again, my heart rouses thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you and concerns many men, many women. Now, little side note, I'm adding that many women part. That was not part of the original poem. However, William Carlos Williams, I believe if he lived now, if he was on this planet right now, he would have written it like that because of who I think he was. So look at what passes for the new. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems, it is difficult to get the news from poems. Yet men die miserably, yet women die miserably every day, every day, for the lack of what is found there. Well, I never was the same after I heard those words. I never, ever was the same. And that poem got inside me. That poem pickles me. That poem contextualizes me. That poem centers and softens me to this very day. And that became a big, huge part of my own life and how I make meaning in my life through poetry. So, we're going to talk again before I sort of give you what I believe are the stages of owning a poem. Let's just experience another poem that you may have heard of if you love poetry. Mary Oliver, who we just lost a few years ago, was such an incredible spirit, an incredible poet, incredible human being. And one of the poems that I think probably one of her most famous poems, certainly in that top 10 list, would be a poem called Wild Geese. And again, this is one that once I stepped into it, it stepped back into me. It owned me first, and then I owned it back. Okay, Wild Geese goes like this. You do not have to be good. You do not have to be good. Now just imagine a poem that starts with that line in our, Puritan culture where everybody has to be good. You've got to be good. You've got to be good at everything. You've got to be perfect. or you're in trouble. Well, she says, she takes that right off the table. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles in the desert repenting. Kind of get the scene there? You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Oh, talk about permission. Talk about giving us permission. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, take that line in, please. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. I always feel like taking a deep breath when I read that poem. I've read that poem. I've recited that poem. I've spoken that poem. I use the word recited. If you've listened to other podcasts, you know that's actually a word that I try to avoid, because when we say we're going to recite a poem, everyone goes and falls asleep. But if you speak a poem, say a poem, perform a poem, that's different. But I always like to breathe deep at the end of performing that poem. And it's just so delicious in so many ways. But that brings me to what I wanted to talk to you about. I don't want to leave this poem yet. Let's talk about it, because I think it's the poster child poem for the point that I'm making, why it's important. Not just to have a casual relationship with some poems, not all of them, maybe only a few. Now I've had adult onset poetry syndrome, which is that's what I call it, for many years. So I do have many poems I feel like I deeply love and that own me and that I own. But it's a special relationship, and it's one where the gifts get deeper, where the rewards get more intense. So what's the stages? Well, I think there are three. And I've already really kind of intimated these, but the first is that we walk inside the poem. And I love that metaphor. I absolutely love that metaphor, because a good poem allows us to walk inside, invites us to walk inside and to have our own experience. You see, I often say that greeting card poetry, and that's fine. I mean, there's a place in this world for greeting card poetry, corny and pedantic and all that. But if you notice that a greeting card poem will beat you over the head and shoulders with the point, you're not invited to walk inside the poem. You're invited to read the words and then have the prescribed feeling that is, overtly given to you. But that's not a great poem. It's not a poem that we love, a poem that we love, a poem that we own and are owned by. Invites us in to walk inside and have our own experience. That's the first thing you know about such a poem. And it also requires something of us, even in that initial stage. We have to, or we need to, walk in with an open heart and an open head, ready for gifts, ready for the inquiry, ready for the intellectual ideas. And all that comes in a poem that we fall in love with. So that's stage one. Does it feel spacious or closed down? That would be a question we'd ask. Does it have lots of permission for us to have our own unique experience. And finally, on stage one of this kind of anatomy of whether or not the poem is going to become a poem that we love and own is, does it feel slightly dangerous? And I mean that in the best way. Slightly dangerous in that it opens us up to boundaries that are a little bit wider than we've had before, opens us up to ideas and feelings that we may never have had before, that we may actually be slightly afraid of. That's what makes it slightly dangerous. Okay, so that's kind of the first stage. The second is, does it feel like the poem is being spoken from inside us? Now, I know that sounds a little weird, but a poem that you love, again, think of the songs that you first fell in love with. Many of us, for most of us, many of us, it was our teenage years, right? And often what brings us, or what brought us to those songs, is the same thing that brings us to poems we love, or at least the opportunity to love them. And that is some kind of hurt. In our teen years, it was often some, unrequited love, or someone that we fell in love with that didn't notice us, again, the unrequited part, or it was something where we were rejected, or just usually it had something to do with hurt. And that's the first time we noticed that joy and hurt, joy and sadness, joy and despair could live in the same space at times. So does the poem feel like it's being spoken from inside you, which is weird, especially if you didn't write the poem? Sometimes you can write poems that become beloved poems, but does it feel like it was spoken from inside your own body, no matter who wrote it? Does the poem, does the poem know you, or some part of you maybe better than you know yourself? That feeling of, I've always wanted to hear it said that way. I couldn't quite say it that way. That's a signal. That's a sign. That's a sign. And again, I want to say that all that I'm saying goes for poems that we write as well. Now, we have to be really lucky to have the muse feed us a poem that becomes a beloved, loved poem of our own, so that we wrote and that we own in that sense. But it can happen. The great poet Ezra Pound once said, if the poet is not surprised in the writing, in other words, then the reader surely will not be either. So we can write poems. In fact, the best ones that we write surprise us just as much as the reader. So, and then finally, number three, in this sort of three stages of is this a poem that's going to own you and you're going to own and love? The third one is, you feel something has happened. You feel something has actually happened. And again, these are the ones that I mentioned in the kickoff of this episode. You remember something better or more. And think about that metaphor. I always love it, literally and metaphorically, to remember ourselves, to put ourselves back together. That's what a good poem. And remember, poems are just stories without the boring parts. But a good narrative, no matter what form it comes in, helps us remember ourselves, put ourselves back together. So that's one. Excuse me, helps us understand, grow, rebalance ourselves in some way, inspire us, make us feel gratitude, or invite us to feel more grateful. And also, loss and healing is a very important one. In fact, as I said, it's loss and hurt that often brings us to poetry and, of course, songs as well, which is just a different form of poetry. Excuse me. Okay, let's keep on cooking. Because I think this poem, The Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, and let me just read the first few lines again. Excuse me. You do not have to be good. You do not have to be good. How stunning is that? We walk inside, the first thing we say is, well, we are welcomed here just the way we are. And we don't have to be, we don't have to work hard. As Robert Bly said, you can lay down on the couch sometimes and just rest and the world will not end. Said that in one of his poems. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles in the desert repenting. Oh, you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Oh, permission. Oh, the invitation is so juicy. It's so juicy. And remember, you get to the end of this poem, pardon me, got to have a little more water. You get to the end of this poem, and she says, whoever you are, no matter how lonely. Again, this poem, the level of invitation, the level of saying, come in, have your own experience, gets deeper and deeper as the poem goes along. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Wonderful poem. Now, maybe some of these poems are going to become your own. I don't know. Maybe not. It's okay. It's all about permission. It's all about walking in and having your own experience. But you will know it because the poem will first own you, and then you will own it. At least the ones that you deeply love. Okay. Now, what I want to do, I just mentioned the poet Robert Bly, who's a great poet and translator, amazing human being and poet and artist, fierce, wild, in so many ways. And interestingly enough, he was friends, very close friends with William Stafford, whom those of you who have listened to this podcast for some time or have taken one of my classes or, know me, you know that I absolutely love the work of William Stafford. He's a mentor, poet from afar. He passed from this plane before I had a chance to meet him in person. But his spirit lives on amazingly in so many poems that he left behind. We're going to get to a William Stafford poem in just a minute because I think it fits for our theme today. But I want to do one by Robert Bly that's about William Stafford. It's called When William Stafford Died. And again, Robert Bly and William Stafford were amazingly close friends, even though they were so incredibly different and different artists, different poets. Here's how the poem goes: When William Stafford Dies by Robert Bly. Well, water goes down the Montana gullies. I'll just go around this rock and think about it later. That's what you said. When death came, you said, I'll go there. I'll go there. There's no sign you'll come back. There's no sign you'll come back. Sometimes my father sat up in the coffin and was alive again. But I think you were born before my father, and the feet they made in your time were lighter. One dusk, you were gone. Sometimes a fallen tree holds onto a rock. If the current is strong, I won't say my father did that, but I won't say he didn't either. I was watching you both. If all a man does is to watch from the shore, then he doesn't have to worry about the current. But if affection has put us into the stream, then we have to agree where the water goes. When William Stafford Died by Robert Bly. Well, water goes down the Montana gullies. I'll just go around this rock and think about it later. That's what you said. When death came, you said, I'll go there. There's no sign you'll come back. Sometimes my father sat up in the coffin and was alive again. But I think you were born before my father, and the feet they made in your time were lighter. One dusk you were gone. Sometimes a fallen tree holds onto a rock. If the current is strong, I won't say that my father did that, but I won't say he didn't either. I was watching you both. If all a man does is to watch from the shore, then he doesn't have to worry about the current. But if affection has put us into the stream, then we have to agree to where the water goes. There's so much to this poem. I've loved this poem for a long time. Now, again, I was able to walk inside this poem, and I felt this poem owned me before I owned it. So it became a poem I loved and that I owned, as we're describing. And it did so many things for me that somehow some of which I can say, some of which I just feel. Because, as an aside, sometimes people say, or I would say and have said that the term in other words, now we do that with poetry. We do that all the time, but it can't really happen. It's not really true, because if there were other words, the poet would have used those words. But we do our best, right? We do our best. And one of the ways I felt really both confronted in this poem and also welcome was the last stanza. If all a man does is watch from the shore, then he doesn't have to worry about the current. To me, that is, if we are a bystander in life, and if mostly what we're doing is sitting in the stands and rah 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 or booing or whatever we're doing, then there's a certain way in which we're not actually in the game. We're just an observer. And life, it seems to me, is much richer, though more dangerous, if we get out of the stands and onto the playing field, metaphorically. He says, but if affection has put us into the stream, so in other words, if what we love, if our meaning, if our purpose, if who we love gets us out of the stands and on to the field, well, all of a sudden we do care about everything that's going on, because we are in it at that point. And this poem invites us, I think, to be in it. Well, we've got to go to a William Stafford poem. This is one of the poems that I fell in love with, that I owned. And I keep saying it owns me. It will own us as well. That's how you know it's such a poem. But it is a poem that William Stafford, who we were just talking about, a poem about William Stafford, this is a poem that Stafford wrote, and it's called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. And I think, I don't know, it's hard to say. For me, it's among the top 15, 20 poems of Stafford, but I love so many of his poems, it's hard to say. This is one of my favorites. A Ritual to Read to Each Other goes like this. Now, again, see if the poem invites you in as you hear it. And what you may want to do is you may want to seek this poem out. This poem is in a bunch of anthologies. You can get it at the library. You can get it online. Just type in A Ritual to Read to Each Other, and put Stafford in there. You'll get it. You'll get it without Stafford, but anyway, it's easy to find. So if you're so inclined, find it and read it as well. See if it invites you in, and see if it begins to do some or all of these three sort of stages or steps that we've been talking about. If you don't know kind of person I am, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Now, first of all, as an aside, that line invited me in, and eventually, after many years, I've read this poem, I can't even tell you how many times. I've spoken it. I can't even tell you how many times. But this poem began to be a poster child poem that allowed me to understand the dynamic behind a demagogue, a political demagogue, a tyrant coming to power. Listen to the words and see if it nudges you in that way at all. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For me, taking on someone's propaganda is to believe in the pattern, the narrative, the story that they are making in the world. And sometimes, if they're talking about other people, and they're talking about other people in negative, sometimes horrible ways, then the intent is to have others feel that way, have others take on that pattern of believing, sometimes of hating the others, and that would have us follow the wrong God home. So again, that was for me. Years later, as I dug into this poem, as this poem kept pickling me over and over and over again. So let's go on. Well, let me start there again and then go on. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible airs of childhood storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but to not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the parade of our lives get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Can we walk inside that poem and have our own experience? Does it invite us in? Does it give us gifts for the head, ideas, the intellect, ideas? Does it give us gifts for the heart? Does it tug at our heart? Does it help us feel more whole? Does the poem begin to feel like it's being spoken from inside you as you hear it? And finally, do you feel like you remember something or know something, or feel more grateful for something, or are inspired by something? A little bit more. Has something happened, in other words? For me, I could talk about this poem all day, and I won't, because I don't want this podcast to be too long. I respect everybody's time. But the line, he says, I call it cruel and maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. When people know, when we know, when I know something is not right, and yet I fear saying something or doing something, makes me human, makes us human, makes us frail, afraid at that particular moment. But it's also a kind of cruelty to know what occurs, but to not recognize the fact, to not say anything. So again, I don't feel scolded by that. I feel understood. I feel a kindred spirit. And I feel like I want to know more about my fellow human beings on this planet, my fellow citizens in this country, than not. And yes, I love this poem. Okay, another wonderful poem. Well, you'll be the judge of that. By David Wagner, but it fits. We got just let's see, we have just I guess this is our last poem. Yeah. And so let's dig into this one, the last one for today's edition of the podcast. It's called Lost by David Wagner, written in 1971. Stand still, stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Seek to know it and to be known. Listen, listen, the forest breathes. It answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, oh, you are truly lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Lost by David Wagner. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is a place called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Seek to know it and to be known. Listen, the forest breathes. It answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again by saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, oh, you are truly lost. Stand still, stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. How many times do we think of being lost? Anytime, in a forest, in a downtown somewhere, in a relationship with someone else, in a relationship with a loved one, in a relationship with ourselves. How many times do we think, I want to just sit and let the other find me? Actually, I think we've all been enculturated, we've been pickled to run around and grab whatever it is to find it rather than to sit still and let it find us. And I think that's what David Wagner is saying here. By the way, he passed away just a few years ago. I had a little correspondence with him late one night over email. I've told this story before, but he was actually up late one night. I found an email for him through the university he was emeritus by then. He used to teach at, wrote him a little email, said I love the poem and had a few questions about it. And he wrote back that night at about 12:30 one night, late, when I was putting together a talk and I was using this poem. And it was great. It was just delicious to be able to have that virtual email contact with him. And this event actually happened to him. I mean, yeah, I mean it happened that he did get lost in those forests up in the Northwest where he lived and taught for many years. But again, can we walk inside? Can we walk inside the poem with an open heart and head? Maybe we walk inside first, and then our heart is blown open and our intellect is blown open by the poem. I don't know how that happens, but I know that that's the kind of thing when we walk in and can have our own experience. I did with this poem. The question is, can you? I don't, or what other poem might you be able to do that with? And does it feel like the poem is being spoken from inside you? Well, for me, yes, it felt like, wow, I never thought of it this way. I never felt it this way. And all of a sudden, this was so juicy because it was a different narrative that was closer to my own, somewhere inside me, my own felt experience. And finally, did it do something for me? Oh, it did lots for me. It helped me remember myself different. It helped me understand my relationship to the great natural world, to the amazing natural world. It made me realize my integration, or feel more my integration into the world instead of being separate from the world, which is one of the big challenges we have right now, feeling separate from, alienated from the natural world. And gratitude, inspiration, I mean, all those things. There were so many levels that it helped me. And the poem itself, I mean, it's almost like a poster child for the theme we're talking about today, because this business of stand still, the forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. It's like, what? What kind of, I mean, what is that? And then you go, oh, yeah, yeah. So it can be, maybe, just maybe, we can talk about a poem this way. Stand still. The poem knows who you are. You must let it find you. We must let the poem find us. That's a interesting way, very much on the theme of this episode. So there's a few ideas to help prime your internal pump to see if there aren't more poems out there that you love and need to make your own. I often say that the half-life of my own happiness and courage and hope and all of that is often quite short. I just sometimes my shortened version of that is to say the half-life of inspiration is very short for me. So I need plenty of poems. I need plenty of ways to pickle myself. I need plenty of ways to remember, to deal with loss, to understand. All of those things. So that's why I believe that having poems we own, poems we love, favorite poems, I mean, even more favorite than maybe some of the other poems that we like, but aren't quite at that depth for us. That's why I think they're so important. That's why I think it's so important to have these poems in our lives. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so we have come to the end of another episode, and I want to thank you for your listening ear. And again, if you've liked or felt inspired by any of this, leave a comment somewhere, refer it to someone else, do a like on not YouTube, or there's going to be in some other places eventually. But anyway, just do all that And but mainly, see if you can't walk inside some poems. See if that poem will first own you as you have your own experience, and then as you maybe fall in love with it and own that poem in the best sense. Okay, as I always say, between now and the next episode, you take good care of yourself.